Welcome to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Rondo Moses.
And I'm Matt Tice. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by
And
disruption.
in each episode, we're going to explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in fast-changing markets.
And we'll share case studies and interviews and interesting insights that sort of unpack these issues based on current events and challenging topics.
So you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And you can also check out our companion articles on our website, insurgentsgroup.com, for a summary of the key takeaways from each episode. Now, let's get started with today's conversation, Matt.
All right, Rondo. So we've got a pretty interesting topic today. We thought it would be interesting to unpack a little bit the Ezra Klein abundance concept and get a sense of, first, what does it mean? And then most importantly, how can we sort of put the abundance concept through the lens of the insurgent mindset and help our audience, and primarily C-suite and director level individuals, to understand, is abundance a concept that could be applied to help businesses unlock growth and achieve their objectives?
Yeah, I think, Matt, for me, I read the book a few weeks ago, about a month ago, actually. And what I took from the book was that, although it's written through a political lens, the book basically was saying how there's a scarcity reality that at least the Democratic Party in this case operates under, and that what they should be thinking about is more of a possibility mindset or possibility way of thinking. And that definitely resonates with how we see some organizations, in particular, when you think about how incumbent organizations operate. I think it's clear that many of them operate more with that scarcity mindset or scarcity thinking.
Yeah, I always use the term sort of zero sum thinking, right? But I completely agree that is one of the main characteristics of the incumbent thinking, and how to unlock and break open, if you will, that perspective to open up the possibilities of growth or innovation, which is often becomes unavailable to the incumbent after a period of time as these structures become heavier and heavier. And as we always talk about, the one of the characteristics of the incumbent is to look ever more internally as opposed to externally.
Right.
And consequently, many things that may be possible become seemingly impossible, maybe without fresh thinking.
Yeah. So if we were helping our audience think about how to think about scarcity and in terms of incumbents, what are some of the key characteristics you would say that a company should be keeping in the back of their mind if they wanted to test whether they're actually operating under a scarcity mindset as opposed to a possibility mindset?
Right. So I think, like I said a moment ago, the first thing is, are you programmed fundamentally to look inside the enterprise versus outside? To me, that sort of drives really when you look at a firm, and a firm has sort of a what I describe as an inside out mindset, which is in my mind probably the leading factor for a scarcity mindset.
Hmm.
What you tend to see is really sub-optimized structures or highly functionalized um, operating models, which work really well in a time of stability and equilibrium, but not so much when things are changing very quickly, for example. Some of
Yeah.
the common themes that we talk about in the podcast quite frequently. But as you start to see how those mindsets then translate into behaviors, and then those behaviors almost graduate to become constraints. And in Ezra Klein's book, he talks about, for example, bureaucratic and regulatory overhead. We also see that in different ways inside enterprises where, you might have, excessive bureaucracy. You might have, to my
Right.
point of functionalization, you might have, different agendas in different parts of the structure that, don't connect or don't collaborate and so on. So these things sort of build up over time.
Yeah, and to your point, I think that bureaucracy, the way it sort of plays out in organizations, you get people focused on the silos in the organization as instead of the problems that they need to solve as an organization. And so you're optimizing for the individual silo, but not thinking about what is the overall integrated view of the organization and what problems do we need to solve, which means that you have to have much more of a cross-functional mindset. So the scarcity mindset is focusing in on just your silo versus the abundant mindset would be thinking about the enterprise or the full picture of your organization and where the opportunities are and how do you solve problems with through that kind of a lens.
Right. I remember, it's been a few years now, but when I wrote the book Insurgents, one of the things we talked about were sort of ecosystems and not castles, right? So,
Right, right,
extrapolating your point, I think also that could apply to a firm that sees themselves largely as a monolith, um, and maybe unwilling to create partnerships or engage with, even productively with competitors at times or bring customers into the loop, for example, which then tend to create a situation which creates external scarcity, which I think is problematic. And
right.
so, also building on your question, I think the one of the things in the in abundance that Ezra Klein talks about is then that translation of that mindset to um, kind of a high degree of risk aversion, and
Yes,
then that sort of that manifests itself in terms of um, more people saying no than saying yes,
yes,
and maybe even a
yeah,
relatively few people who have power in the structure saying no rather than being open to yes. And I think, like, to me, the whole thing boils down to the notion of open to yes, right? So how,
right.
what is the art of the possible? And then how do we unpick the major constraints that are kind of in the way, that will then present opportunities that aren't initially obvious because your mindset is preventing you from seeing them.
Yeah, if everyone sees their main priority is how do they say no, as opposed to how do we get to yes? How do we make this possible in our organization so that we can, achieve big goals, be bold, then you're going to stay stuck in the past. That's why the status quo becomes so sticky for organizations because there's a tendency for people to just really react with no, as opposed to figuring out, well, how do we get to yes? What will it take for us to get to yes for this new opportunity or this new innovation, this new product, et cetera?
So maybe if we sort of presented almost a mini case to sort of get a sense of what that might look like, just to illustrate the point a little bit, without restating the abundance book, which is not what we're here to do, but there are some examples that Ezra Klein shares with regard to things like housing, and probably my favorite example is the high-speed rail corridor in California, and how over a period of decades, they've barely been able to break ground after spending billions of dollars on approvals and trying to break through the NIMBY mindset and all that kind of stuff. Which reminds me kind of almost like an ERP implementation in a large complex firm where sometimes these projects take forever, people
Right,
tripping over each other, and it's really not about the end customer. It's about how the firm operates. And these things don't necessarily um, operate at the speed they need to because people don't step back and say, okay, what's the real problem here? Okay, maybe the problem is, or what's the real constraint almost? Maybe the problem is how are we organized, or how do we do IT approvals, or maybe the problem is we don't have the right skill set in the business, whether that be a bank or a manufacturing firm or whatever. And you're sort of working it through. I think often you run headlong into these projects without really stepping back and understanding, like, how would we apply an abundance sort of mindset to the problem as compared to
yeah,
the scarcity mindset. And I'm just reminded of a fun story that I gave a talk the other week with a group of CEOs, and there was a fellow there that owned a very large plumbing business, and he was complaining about not being able to find the types of resources that he needs to drive growth. And you know, so his mindset was automatically that he's reached a speed limit to his growth. Okay. And as we were, trying to unpack the problem, we talked about, how do we apply your mindset, your assumptions, and your understanding of the constraints almost like in a loop to better understand
Yeah.
how to unpick this. And it was really fun because one of the participants there said, okay, well, let's first have a more open mindset. And he asked a great question, which was, is there a growth constraint? And after a little bit of discussion, it became pretty obvious that it's very much a seller's market in a sense that there's as much work as you could do, but you can't do enough work because you can't get the people, right? So, which is my favorite kind of problem, unlimited market opportunity, and the constraint is internal. But his inability to see through the constraint made it difficult. So, long story short, we got to the point where someone suggested, have you looked at offshoring? Someone else suggested, have you looked at AI? And of course, well, for plumbing, you need plumbers in the field on the ground. A lot of what they do is not very standard. So it's difficult to create automated workflows for any of that stuff, even if you wanted to automate it, very difficult. But the offshoring one, oh yeah, I've looked at that, but you know, all the regulations are in country and not offshore. So how do we
Right.
deal with that? But within about 2 or 3 minutes, someone else, prompted the question, well, is your assumption about labor and offshoring that you couldn't train people offshore to come into this market? Oh, you could never do that. And then someone in the construction industry said, "Oh, well, we've doing that in my business." And sort of, it started to gather, and this individual opened up his mindset. And before we finished the conversation, which took about 10 minutes, um, we started to flesh out a very tangible and real opportunity where potentially this labor could be trained offshore, provided with specific visas to come work onshore, create a lock into those resources for a period of time so that it addresses the churn, et cetera, et cetera. And this opportunity started to emerge where both a new pathway to competitive advantage and a new way to solve the labor problem materialized really only because of that sort of scarcity mindset being broken open.
Yeah. I mean, how do you, because what you're describing is how do you help organizations to sort of see beyond their blind spots, right? Sort of like, you think of the horse when they have their eye patches on, they can't see beyond the peripheral vision is very limited, very narrow. And what through questioning and through bringing in different perspectives, you were able to sort of widen the aperture through which this executive thought about where the possibilities were and the opportunities were. And when I read the book, another thing that came to mind for me was how quickly, for example, we were able to develop vaccines for COVID-19 during the pandemic. I mean,
Mm,
when you think about traditionally, vaccine development would take 7 to 10 years. And maybe that was the scarcity mindset at work that it took so long then. But during COVID-19, we were able to develop vaccines in, 7 to 10 months. We
mm,
actually had a vaccine. And then the distribution of that vaccine was also, more of a open-minded possibility way of thinking because we were able to distribute it very quickly and get vaccines in arms very quickly and able to bring down, the COVID infection rate. So I just think that, when forced to, we're able to think beyond some of the constraints and you always talk about constraints of mind that
mm.
come into play. But we have great examples of when you can move beyond those constraints of mind that you're able to create real big, bold opportunities for your organization.
Right. I mean, I think the idea of constraints is an important one, Rondo, and I think that's a great example. There is some debate one way or the other about whether that's possible in a period of kind of more where there isn't a pandemic and your back isn't against the wall. But I know from experience in talking to leaders in different pharma companies that the new benchmark certainly isn't 1 year, but it's not 10 years anymore. So there is a lot
Right.
of pressure to move that along. But coming back to kind of this idea of constraints, it's an important one that I think is kind of a bit fallen out of fashion in business. And there's a fellow by the name of Eli Goldratt who wrote a book, The Goal. years ago, which sort of illustrated this concept of theory of constraints. And I've always thought this was an important idea. And I think that in IT, for example, that whole concept has really taken new life in, for example, the DevOps movement. Um, but in sort of more mainstream kind of functions and more mainstream firms, you don't hear a lot of it. And I think just unpacking that very briefly is the idea of theory of constraints is that at any given time, there are a relatively few number of bottlenecks that inhibit the throughput of a full system, whatever that system might
Hmm.
be. At a macro level, that might be how do you achieve growth, or in a on a manufacturing line, that might be the uptime of one particular machine. But applying this thinking, overlaying the idea that there are different types of constraints, broadly controllable and uncontrollable constraints. So uncontrollable constraints would be, the customer doesn't want it. For example, you don't
Yeah.
have any control over the customer. You can influence the customer, but ultimately the customer votes with their feet, right? But things like regulations and policy, which are internal and which you control, often the mindset of a leader will be, I can't change that for a variety of reasons. But, the pushback is always, well, if you can control that constraint, you can change that constraint. And then there are constraints of the mind, to your point, which are constraints that, that you create only by your mindset about how you look at a problem, right? So the plumber automatically eliminates this idea of offshoring because of very superficial thinking and a very closed mindset around that. But an open
Right.
mindset, then immediately he sort of, hey, hang on a minute. Maybe if I can crack open my own mindset, then I can make many more things possible. So I think kind of
Yeah.
working with that and playing with it makes a lot of sense. But I don't see it a lot. And certainly in it's something that I spend a lot of time talking to clients about, like what's in the way? How can we move it out of the way? Do you control it? Do you not control it? Challenging people about the assumptions that underpin those constraints and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, when you think about the insurgent mindset, you think about leaders who operate with that kind of mindset, they see constraints as, obstacles to be overcome, as opposed to barriers that are going to prevent them from achieving what they want to achieve. Like they don't, to your point, they don't stop there. They try to rethink the problem, reframe the problem so they can find a way around the issue, as opposed to allowing it to, stymie them from whatever it is that they're trying to achieve.
Hmm.
And I think that that's the point of this, difference between scarcity and, possibility thinking or abundant thinking that, Ezra Klein talks about in his book is you gotta be bold. You gotta, step back and sort of let go of some of the things that kept you from achieving the big ideas or big goals that you set up for your organization. And part of the way that you do that is change your mindset. I think, when we think about insurgents and their approach toward experimentation and learning, that's all about, playing. The idea of play is
Hmm.
also an important aspect of figuring out what the possibilities are. And insurgents are more, open to that kind of play than incumbent type organizations are.
Right. I mean, I guess the fundamental rule is don't get in your own way, right? So what's the point of self-imposed limitations or constraints that kind of create a situation where right out of the starting blocks, you're at a disadvantage to those who
Right.
are able to avoid kicking those own goals and don't live in a world of, we create the scarcity and then choose to live in that world of scarcity, and then fundamentally we're surprised when we're not growing, or when the project it takes longer than we expected or goes over budget, or where morale is really low because you might be pushing it through but it's really painful, for example, and
Yeah.
not being able to get, let alone the board, the C-suite together to kind of figure out how to interrogate those problems. but if they can't interrogate them, it's pretty likely that the people deep in the structure of the organization that are getting things done will not be able to kind of have that, freedom of movement to be able to discover those constraints and then bring the relaxing or removal of those constraints to some fruition. So I think that's something culturally that organizations really need to put a lot of energy into. And what I really like about this abundance concept is for us, it's kind of like I think it's a useful exploration of an analog which exists in the sort of politicosphere, right? So
Hmm.
I've written this really nice book about a particular problem, but the mindset of abundance and the terminology is extremely helpful where you're looking at a problem, whether it's a growth problem or a performance problem or something else. How would I approach this problem with an abundance mindset? I think that's really helpful.
Right. Do you think that a big part of it too, to get to that abundant mindset and abundant thinking, you have to have the ability to reframe problems? I think part of the challenge for some leaders is they're not trying to address the right problem. They're looking at the problem the same way as everyone else is, and they're not thinking differently about what the problem really is, which will open up the possibility for new and innovative solutions that they can try out, alternatives that they may not be able to see because they're looking at the problem the old way in the same way that everybody else is looking at the problem.
I couldn't possibly agree more, Rondo. I think the heart of innovation and one of the sub sort of philosophies or methodologies in innovation design thinking is really it's all about the problem and how the problem is defined and being really granular and clear about what are we trying to solve for whom, and why is incredibly important,
Yeah.
right? So being able to spend that time and think carefully about that's important, but it's not sufficient in a sense to your point that um, as you start to move into solutioneering of that problem, it's being able to approach that problem through a variety of different lenses. That's where the innovation comes
Right.
from. And but if you're solving the wrong problem at the beginning, it's really problematic. And what I think was interesting in the abundance book was kind of the idea that are we solving? It's not explicit, but what I took out of it was, are we solving for putting a high speed rail down, or actually is what we're solving for is solving the NIMBY versus YIMBY, so not in my backyard versus yes in my backyard problem, right? Which is
Right.
a different problem, but that problem is highly related and actually is the constraint in that situation. People don't want the rail in their backyard,
Right.
and consequently they'll fight it. So you're trying to solve for schedules and all the other things, land grants and blah blah blah, which turn out to be really achievable when the problem to be solved is over here. It's about the mindset of the community, where that's where you have to put maximum effort to sort of unpick that problem. So I
Right.
think I love it, Rhonda, what you just said, because often we look at the mechanics of the problem, but not kind of the system of the problem almost, and recognize that there are other actors in a problem that sort of extend beyond, maybe the internal stakeholders that control how that problem is, how that traditional problem might be solved.
And I think by reframing the problem, it helps teams to focus back on the outcome that they're trying to achieve, as opposed to the approach. Over focus on the approach to get there as opposed to the outcome. So you got to be clear as to what's the ultimate outcome. And in that example that you talked about in abundance, one of the examples he was talking about was just housing. We've got to make sure that we've got more housing up for people. So if you could focus on that as the outcome, as opposed to all the constraints around, zoning regulations, et cetera, then maybe you can get to the ultimate outcome of more housing. And how do you get there?
So in my mind, I take that example and say, okay, I would turn that example into thinking about capacity for growth inside of a firm, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so a house is a unit of capacity to drive growth. That could be labor or capital or whatever that might be, right? So then how do I apply that sort of mindset and that thinking to free up more capacity, right? So sort of tying together some of the ideas that we talked about here. Um, where, for example, you might be quite internally focused. You might have a castle mindset, like I talked about before, where
Hmm.
you have to create all the capacity, you have to own all the factories, et cetera, where potentially partnering with a competitor to use some of their capacity to achieve more throughput would be something you'd never think about, but
Right.
because you have a rock hard, rock solid kind of mindset constraint, thou shalt not collaborate with a competitor, for example, right? So why not? You know what I mean?
Right.
And when you start opening that up, more housing becomes available in that example, or more capacity for growth becomes available inside the firm. I think the housing is a really nice example where what we're really talking about is putting more widgets into the machine, and just the machine is the people are the widgets in the housing example. And you sort of take these analogies and run with them, you can find some really interesting opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I thought the book was very interesting reading. It just kept bringing me back to, wow, I see how this connects to incumbent thinking and why it's so important for us to be talking about the insurgent mindset and how leaders can, be more possibility focused as they approach these sort of ever-changing, uncertain environments that we're operating in. Because the status quo thinking is going to get you but so far, right? So how do you embrace possibilities, open yourself up to challenges that maybe and I think the earlier point you made about controlling, when you think about being bold, sometimes you're going to operate in situations that are not predictable, but you have to have that ability to adapt, learn, and evolve. And that's where the opportunities really, I think, are going to come from leaders who can really tap into that ever-changing environment and not be fixated only on predictable markets or opportunities, but opportunities to create new markets and opportunities.
Mm. So, how do you know this is working, right? So, like, first of all, I think reading this kind of material as business leaders is really helpful because, you can read and I think it's useful just to open up your mind is to apply these broader analogs to your thinking, if not your business. So, I
Yeah.
think reading books about politics and history and other things like that, I find a lot more value there sometimes than looking at a business text, for example, where, how would I know this is working is when I'm sitting in a board meeting or in a team meeting and somebody sort of says something like, hang on a minute, we're locked in a scarcity loop here. Um,
Mm,
how would we, how would we apply an abundance point of view or an abundance mindset to this problem, right? What if we open up the constraints? How do we dig deeper to find the bottleneck? How do we, et cetera, all the things that we just talked about?
yeah.
That would be the lens. I would know that I'm starting to build that culture when those questions are kind of coming up more or less unprompted. And I think that's a really helpful way to kind of move things forward in this particular area.
Yeah, how can you create more of a builder mindset, builder way of thinking that fits nicely with the insurgent mindset in your organization by asking those questions, I think is where the opportunity is for people.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, where the rubber hits the road is people are interrogating, they're asking the hard, sometimes not obvious questions, and applying to your earlier point, different lenses on how you see the problem. And only by doing that can you discover, this or transition out of the scarcity sort of mindset and into kind of this abundance philosophy, which I think
Yeah.
I don't think is limited politically, really. I think it's just a nice conceptual frame to solve problems, drive innovation, and move things forward.
Yeah, I would love for our audience to reflect on this conversation and really ask themselves, one, where are you as a leader assuming scarcity when you should be thinking about possibility? It would be one question I would want them to think about. And what systems in your organization are killing good ideas before they even get started? This gets back to your point about what are the constraints that you can sort of move out of the way. And what would it be like for you to sort of reframe the problems you're solving for in your organization? How can you apply that kind of lens to things that you're working on in your organization? I think that those will be important questions for them, our audience, to reflect on, to get more into the insurgent mindset and more possibility thinking.
And not to poke anyone in the eye here, Rondo, but I would challenge the CEO, senior manager, general manager, board director, um, to ask, are you the problem, right? In a
Mm,
sense that, are you the one that's stuck in a scarcity loop and not sort of, looking more broadly at these challenges that your organization faces? Often, all other things being equal, these leaders are the ones that are sort of perpetuating this scarcity mindset through restrictive KPIs or risk aversion in capital decision making, right? So
yeah,
you can see the
yeah,
symptoms pretty easily from the outside in, but they're very difficult to see from the inside out. Anyway,
yep,
that probably covers us for today, but thanks, Rondo, for putting this idea on the table. And I think this is a great example of where insurgent mindset meets, sort of you know, almost contemporary thinking in politics, and it's a great example of how we can shift our mindset in a very important way.
absolutely. So I hope our audience have enjoyed this conversation today. I appreciate them listening. And just reminder, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
And if you have a moment, share your questions and comments, and we'd love to revisit this topic at some point in the future. Thanks very much, Rondo.
Thank you, Matt.
All right, all the best. We'll see you next time.